Thank you for joining me for the third episode of my conversation with Todd Thurman. Todd's 25-year experience in pork production in both the United States and internationally provides interesting perspective and outlook. In this episode, he answers our 5 standard questions with a depth that takes us to places I did not expect. With every podcast, whether we're talking about a human interest one or timely ag topics, I got 5 questions for you. And it relates back to what we talked about before, that we're trying to find out how people's ag roots have set them up for success in their career and life. So that first question, and we've probably already talked about some of these, so just say we already talked about it. What is one lesson that agriculture has taught you that you carry with you every single day?
That one's pretty easy. For me, I think it's adaptability. I think just the nature of agriculture necessitates adaptability. You know, if you're going to be successful, if you're rigid and linear in your processes, you're going to struggle in this industry. Essentially we're dealing with nature, and there are, so many critical variables that are almost entirely outside of our control, whether, in any part of agriculture, but whether that's a disease challenge on the livestock side, or whether that's a, weather issue on the crop side, or, whatever it is. I mean, there's so much of those variables, not just, tangential variables, but critical variables, are completely outside of our control. And so your ability to be adaptable, tough, resilient, stubborn, maybe, is critical, to the extent that if anybody's lasted very long in this industry at all, they've got those characteristics in spades. I mean, that's one of the things, if you meet somebody that's been in agriculture for 20 years, there's a few things for sure about them, and one of them is that they're adaptable. So that's, that one's an easy one for me. That's by far and away the one lesson that I've learned in agriculture, and it has been helpful to me in my career, and it's been helpful to me in my personal life. And it's a great skill, great characteristic to have.
As a side note, it's interesting that half the people that answer that come up with, I had livestock as a kid and it taught me responsibility. But the other half answered some way on adaptability. My son answered as grit, and they're the same thing. You're just powering through the curveballs that Mother Nature sends at you. That's ag. The second question, if you could spend an afternoon with any agricultural figure from history, who would it be?
I think I would have to go with Charles Goodnight. I don't know how much you know about Charles
cowboy.
Goodnight, but he was a rancher in the 19th and I guess early 20th century, in the Texas Panhandle, where I'm from. But he was the Lonesome Dove, which is one of my favorite books and movies or TV programs or whatever, is loosely based on Goodnight and Loving. But he was credited with a huge range of innovations, most notably the Goodnight Loving Trail, which was allowed cattle producers in Texas to access northern markets. And that was just profound. I'll get the numbers wrong, I'm sure, but it was typical that cattle would sell for $2 to $3 in Texas, and they might be worth 30 or 40 in northern markets, right? Because transportation was just a huge challenge. So this is before trains and before trucks. And so that was a huge innovation. It sounds so simple now, but it was a huge innovation and a massive accomplishment. But he also invented the chuck wagon, and you'll have to maybe fact check me on that. But and then he established a school with his wife to educate ranchers' kids. Which was a huge problem. I mean, you had these huge ranches, and then they're a long ways from schools, and obviously transportation was an issue. So I think they call it an academy.
Okay.
And then I think he was just. He also was a big conservationist. He established the conservation herd of bison that ended up forming the original herd at Caprock Canyons State Park in Texas and in Yellowstone. So
really,
those bison, when you go to Yellowstone, those bison are largely the descendants of that original herd that Goodnight established. So, a little fun fact there. But I think really, he was, obviously he's from my part of the world, and my grandpa actually met him.
Okay.
When he was a little kid, he went with his dad to try to sell a bull to Charles Goodnight. I don't think he bought the bull, but he told that story. So that sort of piqued my interest in Goodnight from the beginning. But you can make an argument that he and his ilk were the first industrial agriculturalists in the U.S., that really were doing things at scale. And so I think that's really interesting. I think he'd be a great conversation. That'd be an interesting brain to pick. And he lived at a time that was really a lot of technological change and I think he was born in the 1830s, and he lived well into the I think maybe he died in 1920s or something like that. So you think about that, Civil War, turn of the century. You saw a lot of technological change. You saw a lot of cultural change. I mean, he was with the Texas Rangers that recaptured Cynthia Parker.
Wow.
Parker's mom.
That is cool.
And so, just a cool historical figure. And as I think about agriculture figures, really one of the pioneers, I think, in a lot of ways of agriculture at scale, and a hell of an entrepreneur too. So.
He found a need in ag, and he filled it with the Goodnight Loving Trail. Just that one thing is huge. Did not see that one coming. What is one obscure or quirky thing about agriculture you think more people should know?
I alluded to this earlier, but I mentioned that I judged livestock in college. I wish more people knew about that. I used to love hiring people who judged, because it just teaches a set of skills that is not common, and in our general education system does not do a very good job of addressing. And it's so much more than just, in fact, the livestock piece of it. The practical aspects of the livestock piece of it are probably pretty minor, I guess, in my view. But it just is it's an amazing way to teach critical thinking and decision making, and communication. I mean, I don't know of any other, discipline or activity that really combines that critical thinking / decision making and the requirement to communicate and, articulate your process, and those are just, those are very valuable, intensely practical, and increasingly uncommon skills. So I wish more kids would pursue that, and whether they get into ag or I can't imagine a profession or a career where that wouldn't help you. Again, it's obviously if you get into, a tech career, being able to tell the difference in a good pig and a bad pig, probably not particularly valuable, but that process of having to have a process and then critically having to defend, or explain or articulate your thought process. One of the things I love about judging is that you can get the decision wrong and the thought process right.
Show your work, kinda, right?
Yeah. And there was times when I would I'd give the reasons, and the feedback would be, I think you really missed the technical piece, but your explanation was not irrational. Like you almost convinced me.
That's right. You got a 20 on placing, but a 48 on the reason trip.
Exactly. And so, that was that's certainly not the reason why I got into it. I just thought it'd be, I thought it'd be cool to be around animals, and it was always a cool bunch of people, and I got didn't realize it at the time, but I judged for Jerry Hawkins, who is a legend in junior college livestock judging, and so learned a lot of leadership lessons from him, and being part of that program. I always tell people I was the weakest link on a championship judging team.
There you go. You're a small fish in a big pond, right?
Yeah, yeah, but great, experience for me. And I wish more people in ag and outside of ag knew about that, because it is a fantastic program.
Where else do you encourage a student to set a standard, evaluate something against that standard, make the decision to that standard, and then defend your decision? And like you said, you could be wrong with why you placed them, but you've gone through the process and convinced somebody else of, or maybe not convinced them, but explained. And isn't that kind of what we do in sales? Here's a product, here's what you want, and here's why you should buy it.
There's all kinds of, like analogies. I mean, science, same way. I mean, it's exactly what you do when you establish a thesis and you collect data, and then, and you kind of present your results. And, I mean, it's just like sales, really just like almost every aspect of life, those skills just, that specific combination of skills comes in handy. And it's just a really elegant way to combine them, I think. And certainly you can judge other things and other than, livestock, but that process, that concept is just, it's worth its weight in gold. I wish there was some way we could expand that dramatically, and teach those skills. And you just can't replicate that in a classroom.
No. And nice thing about your illustration, and I didn't think about it until you were talking about it, is that it combines it and it doesn't take it bit by piece. And I think back to when I took biochemistry, and we talked about the Krebs cycle, and then we talked about fat oxidation, and we talked about carnitine, and it was because this chapter covered it and this chapter covered it, and you remembered it on that chapter. But it didn't make sense until I took bionutrition, where we put it all together and like, oh, the Krebs cycle does this, and then the carbon comes off here and the ATP here and it does here. And judging does that. It tells you how to think. And it's like, here's your math problem. Well, in math, you do your work and you get an answer, but you don't have to defend it. Whereas judging, you made your decision, defend it, and live with your consequences. It puts it all together. It's a real life experience that I enjoyed at college. And the other thing that I think that you probably didn't experience, when I was judging, I would get anxious. And I remember getting ready for Louisville. We were working out. I think it was a bunch of Charolais heifers, and my judging team coach came up and said, "You need some Valium, man. You're just worked up." I'm like, "Yeah, it's Louisville, man. Come on." And there were like 3 of us on Purdue's team that judged every single contest. I was one of them. I was always in the middle. But overcoming that fear of placing them wrong was huge for me, and it's paid off in my career because I've been wrong a few times.
It's high pressure, and it, you're sitting there and you're given the reasons, and some of those guys, those reason takers are really good at giving you that look that's very ambiguous. It's like, I don't know if he's buying what I'm selling or if he thinks I'm crazy, And so, you just kind of, it also builds a certain amount of, self-confidence, I think, that, that you have to have, because if you go in there and deliver the right placing and the right reasons without confidence, it's not going to come across right, And so, yeah, I mean, I talk about the decision-making, critical thinking, and the communication skills, but it's a real confidence builder too. I think just, and you're just doing it on, repetitively. It's not like you're really constrained and you're doing it over and over again. So, yeah, it's a really unique, I think, discipline. And I just really wish there was a way we could expand that and give more people exposure to it.
That is definitely obscure. So you get the gold star for obscurity so far. What's your favorite agricultural tool, product, innovation?
I was going to go really big picture, but actually I'm going to take the opposite approach. I'm going to say the Borbot.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is because, I mean, it's definitely kind of like a small thing. But I think it's a great example of technology that didn't just reduce labor requirements, right? So, but it actually allowed you to do it better, right?
Okay.
So, having a bore bot, and for those that might be listening that don't have any idea what I'm talking about, it's essentially a remote control device that allows you to move the bore is tethered to. Sometimes they're in a crate, but you move back and forth. And when you're heat checking sows or breeding sows, you can move the bore without having to have a handler, right? Mm-hmm. So there's some safety issues here because bores can sometimes be unpredictable. So that's part of it. So you take the human out of that equation from a safety standpoint. And it's a really heavy object, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're, once the bore is trained to it, you're allowed to put that bore in exactly the right place.
Yes. And for the amount of time he needs to be there.
Yeah. And for however long he needs to be there. Exactly. And a really good, well-trained handler and a well-trained bore, you can do that too. But the reality is that doesn't happen very often. And so, and it freed up, a person to be on the other side of the crates, mm-hmm. Actually doing something that humans are a lot more, adapted to or are good at, right? So I think it's a good example as we think about automation, whether it's automation of cognitive processes with AI or whether it's, taking this to the next step with robotics. I really think that we should be focused on these technologies that don't just replace human labor, but ones that by replacing or displacing that human labor, they're additive, right? So it's not just mm-hmm. Hey, we don't have to hire that person, or we don't have to put that person in harm's way, but it's the result is actually better. And so that's like the home run, I guess, in terms of those applications. Again, it's a small, kind of a small issue, kind of certainly obscure to anybody outside of the pork industry. But I think it's a great example, and I think that's what we should be focused on. In fact, I think technology-wise, I am of the opinion that we might not be going down the right path here. I think there's an obsession with humanoid robots that is mm-hmm. a little bit bizarre to me. Yeah. And there's an obsession with linking artificial intelligence with human intelligence and defining artificial intelligence in human intelligence terms. And I think, and I could very well be wrong, and there's certainly a lot of smart people that are on the opposite side of this argument. So I'm hesitant to get too aggressive about it because, Elon Musk, for example, would be taking the other side of the argument, and matching wits with Elon Musk is not on my agenda. But I really just think that that we're missing the boat to a certain degree, that we need to be looking for those areas where not replacing things that humans are good at, but replacing things that humans are not good at or that humans don't want to do or that are, dangerous or whatever. And that's a much more value added way of thinking about it. I think the Borebot is a very small but good practical example of that type of innovation.
I think when we have our discussions about artificial intelligence or technology in ag, we whistle past the graveyard on things that we're already doing. And we think about artificial intelligence in ag as this huge, we got all this data and what are we going to do? And we think about yield data and how we can put all that together and make decisions industry-wide, when maybe the biggest impact would be these small things. And think about the artificial intelligence that we already have on a pig farm. You got Borebots. We've got bin monitors. We've got switches that turn off feed lines. So we already have things that we're incorporating that have made life easier. Go back to your example of not getting the right feed in the right bin at the right time. I mean, we've incorporated that artificial intelligence that is kind of double-checked human, but we're already incorporating that. And I think we do a disservice by relying on our thought leaders to define what artificial intelligence is.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've done in my business is we've tried to identify those decisions that are consequential, that are made with less than optimal data, right?
Okay.
So one example of that would be cull keep decisions in a farrowing house. Arguably one of the most consequential decisions on a sow farm. Am I going to keep this sow and breed her again, or am I going to cull her? And the vast majority of those decisions are made by largely inexperienced frontline employees using very minimal amounts of data. Maybe the sow card,
Mm-hmm.
And with very little context,
Yeah.
you go talk to them and say, how do you make these decisions? And very often, even the context of, whether I have plenty to breed this week or not enough to breed this week, or how many gilts do I have available, they're not even fully, incorporating some of those factors in there. And so, that's a decision that AI, it ought to make the decision, and you ought to have to override the AI's decision on that, because
Well, you could almost make the decision when she hits a crate.
right, for sure. Yeah. That's true.
And they turn that in if then. If she does this, she stays. If not, she goes. You and I can incorporate that now, get into PigChamp data, and it puts a big red X on the card, and it's already done. We don't take the data we already have and use that.
Right. It just doesn't happen. Right. And so those are areas, at least from a cognitive perspective, that are ripe for, injecting a more automated, process, into that. And those are things that, AI tends to do well, and humans are not particularly good at. One of the things that I've been experimenting a lot with on AI is data analysis. And one of the things that I've noticed is that I think I'm pretty good at pattern recognition, right?
Okay.
I think that's kind of a natural talent of mine. And so I feel a little bit threatened because you hear all the time that AI is really good at that. For now, anyway, my experience has been that it is good at that, but that it tends to identify different patterns, different kinds of patterns than what I identify. And so it's complementary in that way.
Yeah.
So it's not like I'm outsourcing the analysis. It's just that, I'm kind of putting my 2 cents in, and then it's coming up with things that I completely missed. And it often misses stuff that I picked up on.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly how to articulate that yet. And I'm not even 100% sure, what that means. And maybe that changes, but that's definitely a complementary, enhancement as opposed to a replacement. So I think as we better understand what these machines are good at and what they're not good at, I think finding those opportunities high leverage opportunities to implement it will be a huge opportunity.
Your example of a bore bot, I like it. It's very specific. It's small, and might be an example for us to think beyond AI as this huge conundrum for us to solve, when in reality, if we just do little things with AI, we'll make some successes.
Yeah, and it's just the other thing too is that I talk a little bit about the boar bot, and it's definitely not a humanoid.
No.
It's doing something. Its design is purpose for a specific purpose, right? And I certainly see the argument for a general use, robot that is built for a world that's designed for humans. I get all that, but I'm actually more excited about these specific, more custom designed opportunities, both on the AI side and on the robotic side.
Well, I think your illustration of the keep call decision is a great example of a necessary problem, but it does not fall underneath the task of urgency on a swine farm.
Yep. Yeah, it just really doesn't. And if you think about it, especially in the reality that we live in, you could say, well, training, we could do a better job of training people. But man, I mean, the reality is your turnover is so high on these farms that you just can't keep them trained up. As soon as you get them trained, they're moving on and doing something else. So, that's another issue we should probably try to resolve. But it's just the reality is, if you think about that, if you just take a step back from that, it's crazy.
Yeah. Well, you think about the keep call decision is a math problem.
Uh-huh.
You set up an algorithm, you set up the calculus. There's no need for training outside of, hard labor, prolapse, the things that a human needs to be involved in. But the rest of that it's math. It's a simple if-then basic program, right?
Yeah. Well, and it can get more complicated than that. One of the challenges is you're implicitly asked to predict what performance would be if you kept that animal. And especially the more advanced she gets parity wise,
Mm-hmm.
you have fewer and fewer data points to make that decision on, right? So what can we expect from a, ninth parity animal versus a third parity animal? That's, there's just less data out there. And so at some point AI might be able to, either collect, go grab enough data to be able to make a better decision there, or, just do a better job of predicting what that performance might be or something. But yeah, I mean, replacing that decision with an automated process doesn't even require AI. It does, just a simple algorithm really would get us way further than where we're at right now.
Setting that algorithm up is part of what we think about as AI. And AI is, the automation of it is just hitting that right button or setting up the right equations. So,
yep.
Interesting. So the last question is, what is one small act or change you think can make the biggest difference in ag's future?
Oh, we've talked about a few of those. Maybe I'll try to think of one. We sort of addressed this a little bit, but one of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is applying strategic foresight and long-term business planning. I was introduced to the strategic foresight concept a while back, and I just found it really applicable in agriculture. So I think in ag, we do a really good job of planning for the near-term future. If there's a weather forecast or a futures market for it, we're on top of it. So I think in the 12 to 18 month time frame, I think we probably do a better job than most industries in planning for the future on that time frame. There's a few companies, few businesses, few producers that do a pretty good job on that medium term, 18 months to say 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. Having an idea of kind of, not just what we're going to be doing in the immediate future, but kind of where's this going on a little bit longer term. But very few of my clients around the world spend any time at all thinking about a longer time horizon, 5 to 10 years.
Okay.
And I think that's becoming an increasingly concerning problem. As the pace of change sort of increases, not being able to get out in front of those issues and have an understanding of what's coming, I think is depending on how you look at it, is either an opportunity for somebody that can wrap their mind around that, or a real disadvantage for those that can't. And a lot of that comes back, and a lot of the feedback that I get, and frankly, some of my thinking on that before I discovered the strategic foresight framework was, it's a waste of time. Like, who knows what's going to happen in 5 to 10 years? You can't predict the future. And I believe that. I think you can't predict the future. Right? Yeah. What strategic foresight does is that it allows you to spend time in that more distant future in a way that's productive. Right. Okay. And so we could do a whole podcast on that, but the short version of that, the super short version of that, is it utilizes a scenario planning process where you kind of define some different scenarios that maybe are not, your prediction, and maybe they're not even likely, but they're plausible. So that's your standard, is kind of a range of scenarios that could play out over the next 5 to 10 years. And then you explore each of those scenarios independently, and think through the implications. And so what you're saying is, this is plausible. This scenario is plausible. And if this scenario comes to pass, how would that impact our business? And what could we do to prepare for that? Or maybe even influence the likelihood that this, favorable or unfavorable scenario plays out. And I have found that process to be extraordinarily useful. Most of the time when you get a group of business leaders together and talk about the future, it ends up being Jim thinks this is going to happen, and Todd thinks Jim's crazy, and he thinks this is going to happen. And so you end up spending all your time advocating for why you think, why your scenario or your prediction is going to come true. And that can be entertaining, but it's not particularly productive.
Yes.
What this process does is it separates you from the personal attachment to that, and forces you as a group to think through these different scenarios. And so a lot of times what you come up with is, wow, we explored these 5 dramatically different scenarios, but we discovered some commonalities and some capabilities that if we develop are going to be pretty useful across a pretty wide range of those plausible outcomes. And so if you find those things, those are some things you can feel pretty confident that you can invest in preparing, developing those capabilities, and get a head start on everybody else. And it just allows you to spend some time, not an extraordinary amount of time, but a significant amount of time thinking about the future in a way that these things are much less likely to sneak up on you. AI looks like to almost everybody like it came out of nowhere. It's like I vaguely knew what AI was, and then ChatGPT, and it was like, wow, that just happened overnight. But I mean, you go talk to the people that have been working in machine learning and AI. This has been, they've been working on this for 30, 40 years, So to those guys, it might have been a surprise that, exactly when it happened. But, they will tell you that they saw this coming, that they didn't predict exactly how it was going to play out. But 30 years ago, if you were in machine learning and AI and you spent a lot of time in the strategic foresight framework, what happened with ChatGPT is not going to be a huge surprise.
Okay.
You're going to have explored similar type scenarios at some point. And so, that alone to me is excuse enough. And it's not like you're trying to commit 10 hours a week to doing this. This is, something that you get together a few times a year with some of your, key thought leaders and hash this out. And I think it's just extraordinarily beneficial. And almost nobody's doing it.
I like the way that it's titled as strategic foresight as opposed to crisis management. And the first one I thought of when you brought it up was ASF. What happens if ASF hits? And I think every big farm should have that. But if you put that in ASF and you go, whatever, pick something else and you all talk about it as something that might happen as opposed to, oh crap, this might happen. I think that would open up your mind to explore opportunities and solutions rather than put on your guard and like, this is going to ruin our life.
Yeah. Well, and it that process results in a lot of happy accidents too. One of the examples that I give in the pork industry is that you're probably familiar with the exercise that the industry went through to get a role play, basically an outbreak of ASF, right? And different constituencies, and let's get into the room and say, okay, here's what happens. What would we do, right? And one of the things that came to light in that exercise was, what do we do with a mass casualty event, right? Where we have to destroy a bunch of animals. And we weren't set up for that, we were set up for handling routine mortality. And so that was a big eye opener for a lot of producers. It's like, wow, what would we do in that scenario? And so the wise ones that, either were involved in that process or heard about it, got together and said, okay, well, let's come up with some sort of plan for what we would do if this situation came up. Lo and behold, just a few months later, after that exercise, we ended up having this issue with disruption due to COVID. And that's exactly what a lot of these producers had to do, right? Completely different reason. I mean, and nobody would argue that, that discussion involved, predicting that we were going to have a, human pandemic that disrupted the processing and all that kind of stuff. But the reality was, you spent some time in the future thinking about a scenario that was plausible, and you had a happy accident that it happened to, prepare you for something that was, different but had the same effect, right? And so, it's just there's several examples of that, and very few industries are, really good at that. I would say this is probably one area where the defense industry is pretty good, especially the military is pretty good at this. And this is really where a lot of that learning comes from. But man, I mean, if you're looking for a competitive advantage moving forward, to me, that developing that sort of practice is a very low risk, very high potential return investment. And I just hope more people in our industry develop those capabilities within their organizations.
The byproduct of getting your strategic team together, you get that immediate team building around future thought. And if you do it right and you take down the barriers and let people just be themselves, I mean, that could be huge for how your team manages immediate, let alone long term.
And it can be, for certain people, it can be very engaging. Right. It's funny. I've been through with a few clients, I've been through this process with a couple of clients, and it's funny. And almost every group we've had, it's a relatively small group, usually, 5 to 8 people in the room as we go through the process. And I kind of teach them the process itself and act as sort of a facilitator. Every time you see certain people are energized by the process, and other people are exhausted by the process, right? And sometimes both of them will tell you they enjoyed it. The people that are energized by it almost universally enjoyed the process. But even the ones that were exhausted by it, a lot of times will tell you, I really enjoyed that process, but it was just, it required me to exercise muscles that I haven't used in a while, and it's almost, and every time they say that, I immediately think about, I used to ski quite a bit. I haven't skied in a long time, but when you haven't skied in a while, and you make that first run, and you're like, wow, those are muscles that I don't use on a routine basis.
Why does that hurt on the outside of the leg? It makes sense.
I didn't even know there was a muscle there.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I do. I think it's a great exercise for team building and for engagement. There's all kinds of side benefits to it, but I find opportunities to apply those concepts in a lot of different places too. We've done a lot of modeling. And that's one of the things that we've adopted is that we try to always, do projections that have a range associated with them. We try not to say, okay, look, here's a model. This is what we built. This is what the model says. We try to imagine, a range of scenarios and say, okay, we think, probably assuming our variables are, accurate, which every model assumes, this is sort of a range of plausible outcomes there. And so, it's really, that concept is really infected in a good way, a lot of our internal processes. And it's been a really positive thing, I think.
That's an interesting topic, and you and I will have to sit down over beer when we get together and talk about that one, because I think there's a lot of opportunity for everybody to do some strategic foresight. Well, Todd, we've spent more time than I expected, and we've covered a lot more topics than I expected, and I sure appreciate you cutting out some time from your busy day to spend time with me and our audience. Your 25 years in the industry, starting out at a farm in Arkansas, going to Russia, starting your own company, it brings some experiences to our industry that I'm glad you shared with us, and I look forward to learning more from you as we spend time together in the future. For my audience, thanks for spending the time with us and getting to know Todd Thurman. This is our first real deep dive into an ag topic of some consequence, and I'm glad you spent time with us. There will be more like this, and Todd, thank you for spending time with us on Patio Potting Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad you're doing this. I was one of the people that encouraged you to do it in the first place, and I couldn't be happier that you're doing it, and hope you have continued success with it.
Great. Thank you, Todd. Thank you for listening to this last episode of my conversation with Todd Thurman. Stay tuned in future episodes where we continue our dive into timely agricultural topics and dig deeper into our guests to find the expected and the unique in their agricultural experiences.